I became homeless because my family left me without an inheritance and kicked me out of the house. What would you do if your own family left you with nothing? In December 2022, I still had a normal life. I worked an average job at a small company in Ohio, living in the family home where I grew up. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. However, everything changed within just a few weeks. My parents had always been an example of a strong but strict family. My brother Michael, my sister Sarah, and I grew up together, and although we were different, I always believed in family values. Our house on the outskirts of town, built back in the 1960s, was a sanctuary for me. But when my parents passed away in September 2022, we were left to deal with the issue of inheritance on our own. I was certain everything would be fair, but things turned out very differently. At first, we were assured that the will would divide the inheritance equally among the three of us. But when it came time to go over the documents, I realized I had become the victim of a scheme. Sarah suddenly received ownership of the entire house and most of the assets. Michael got his share, though smaller, but still much larger than mine, and I was left with almost nothing, a few insignificant items and debts. I tried to figure out what went wrong, but my family avoided the conversation and ignored my questions. My life started to fall apart. I was hopelessly confused. At first, I sought support from friends, but few people understood what it's like to be thrown out on the street by the very people closest to you. I felt betrayal and fear. No home, nowhere to wait until things settled down. By mid-December, it had become the darkest time of my life. I lost my job because of constant breakdowns and absences due to stress. Eventually, I found myself homeless. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. Just a few months ago, I had a home, and now my existence had been reduced to finding a place to sleep and trying to survive. My life became a series of painful memories of what I had lost. I didn't even have time to process everything, because every day was a struggle for survival. Every time someone walked past me, I thought, do they realize this could happen to anyone? Comments from Reddit users. Survivor, 1979. It's impossible to imagine what it's like when your own family deceives you so cruelly. It's not just losing an inheritance, it's losing trust in the people closest to you. Lonely Heart, 88. I feel your pain. When my family fell apart over money after my grandmother passed, I was left with nothing too. Money ruins everything, even what seems unbreakable. Just trying to live. This is terrifying. You think you know your family your whole life, and then they show their true colors. I hope you find a way out of this situation. After my parents' death, I hoped that our family would stay together, supporting each other through the difficult time. But things didn't go the way I imagined. The will, which I had only seen once, was clear and fair. Everything was supposed to be divided equally between me, Sarah, and Michael. We all understood that the family home was the main asset, so we needed to find a solution that worked for everyone. But when the lawyer informed us about the changes in the will, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. It happened on October 10th, 2022. I remember that day well. We all gathered in the lawyer's office in the city center. The small room was filled with tension, though I didn't yet understand why. Sarah sat with an expression that could be mistaken for confidence, while Michael nervously drummed his fingers on the table. I tried to convince myself that nothing bad would happen, that everything would go as we had agreed. But when the lawyer started reading the new text of the will, my vision went dark. All the major assets, the house, money, and investments, went to Sarah. Michael received a substantial amount of cash and securities, and I was left with just a few small items. an old furniture set that needed repair, and my grandfather's clock, which had long since stopped working. I was literally left with nothing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This must be a mistake," I said, turning to the lawyer, but he just shrugged, claiming that this was indeed the latest version of the will signed by my father. How? When did this happen? I know my father would never leave me without a roof over my head. I felt something was off, but proving anything at that moment was impossible. Sarah didn't even try to hide her joy. She said she planned to sell the house and maybe invest the money in her own business. She talked about it so casually, as if she was discussing the sale of an old bicycle, not our family home, our legacy. I couldn't find any words. Desperation and anger began to mix within me, turning into a dull, suffocating pain. Michael just remained silent. His eyes avoided mine, and I realized that he knew everything and had no intention of supporting me. That evening, as I walked home, I realized for the first time that I no longer had a home. Sarah gave me 2 weeks to vacate the house. "It was just your temporary residence anyway," she said, without the slightest bit of compassion. I was overwhelmed with helplessness. How did it happen that everything I thought was stable in my life crumbled so quickly? The first few days after I found out about the change in the will passed like a blur. I was in shock, trying to understand how and why it all happened. My thoughts kept circling around one question: why? How could my own family do this to me? The feeling of betrayal grew sharper with each passing day. I couldn't find an explanation that would ease the pain, even slightly. A few days after that meeting, I decided to talk to Michael alone. I still had hope that he hadn't played an active role in this scheme, that, like me, he had been manipulated by Sarah. We agreed to meet at our favorite cafe downtown, where we often used to sit. That morning, I didn't even drink coffee. My body was entirely consumed by anxiety. Michael arrived late, which was unusual for him. He looked tired, but he tried to pretend that everything was fine. We exchanged brief greetings, and I immediately got to the point. "Michael, explain to me. What's going on? Why did you and Sarah do this? We've always been close." He hesitated a little, avoiding eye contact, but eventually started speaking. "John, I don't fully understand everything that happened myself. Sarah, she said this would be better for everyone, that we should handle the inheritance in a way that would benefit us more. She convinced me that you wouldn't be able to use the money or property wisely, and that it was a risk for all of us." These words hit me like a cold shower. How could my own brother so easily believe something like that? How could he think I didn't deserve my share? "You do realize she just wants to keep everything for herself, right?" I said, barely containing my anger. Michael just sighed, clearly without an answer. In the end, he said, "John, I've already made my decision. This isn't what I wanted, but everything is settled now. Maybe you should just start over. I know it's hard, but you're strong. You'll manage." Those words tore apart the last thread of trust I had in him. He had simply chosen not to fight and to take his piece of the pie, and I was left alone in this battle. The next few days were a nightmare. I tried talking to Sarah, but she refused to meet in person. All our conversations were through text messages, which were cold and dry, as if we were not family, but just business partners. She told me that she had already arranged to sell the house and that I had to vacate it by the end of the month. "This isn't fair. This is our home, not just a house," I texted her. Her response was just as cold. "You need to move on, John. It's just property. It's better for you to start a new life." A fresh start? How could I start a new life when everything I had was destroyed by greed and betrayal? I had nowhere left to return to. My home had turned into a commodity, manipulated without any emotion. My existence was reduced to days that blurred together in a fog of fear and despair. I tried to find a legal way out of this situation, but I had no money for a lawyer. The small savings I had went toward paying the bills and debts left after my parents' funeral. I could no longer afford to live in the rented apartment, and the only thing left for me was to wait for the day when I would have to leave the house. It was late October 2022. I sat in our living room, where we used to gather as a family, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. Every room was filled with memories. Here, my father and I repaired furniture. There, my mother and I baked Christmas pies. And now, all those memories were being erased, along with the future that had been taken from me. In the final days before the eviction, I didn't know what to do. I felt like a ship that had lost its rudder with no direction to sail. All my attempts to find legal help were unsuccessful. With no money and no friends who could support me financially, I began to realize that I was losing control of my life. November arrived, and the weather began to change. The cold wind was already a reminder that winter was coming soon. I started selling off what little I had left: old books, furniture, electronics. Everything that had once been part of my life turned into money that quickly disappeared for daily needs. The hardest thing to sell was my grandfather's watch. It had always been a symbol of family history, but now it was just another item I had to trade for survival. Sarah had no intention of making any compromises. She contacted a realtor and was already planning house showings for potential buyers. Every time people came to see our home, I felt like my heart was being torn apart. How could they put a price on the place where I spent my entire childhood? For them, it was just real estate. But for me, it was the last connection to my parents. Yet no one cared about my feelings. At the beginning of December 2022, things got even worse. I had just 1 week left before I had to leave the house. My despair turned into panic. I didn't know where to go or what to do. All my attempts to find affordable housing or temporary shelter were in vain. Prices had risen, and there weren't enough places in shelters. I even reached out to a few friends, but no one could offer me long-term shelter. I began to avoid sleeping. I watched television until morning, walked outside at night to avoid falling asleep. Sarah noticed that something was wrong with me, but I couldn't explain anything to her. How could I tell her that I was afraid to fall asleep? Because every dream turned into a nightmare. I couldn't allow myself to relax, knowing that as soon as I closed my eyes, I would be pulled back into that labyrinth of fear and pain. The dreams started to haunt me even during the day. I could just be sitting on the couch and suddenly feel the floor beneath me turn into a scorching desert. I saw them, these bodies, even when I was awake. They haunted me completely. I began to lose my sense of reality, unable to distinguish where dreams ended and real life began. The anxiety grew with each passing day. I could no longer tell what was real and what was not. Over time, I realized that these dreams were more than just memory restoration. They were a part of me, a part of what I had lost but couldn't recall. I tried to understand what they meant, why they kept coming back. Maybe they were remnants of my memory trying to break through. Maybe it was my subconscious trying to warn me about something. But whatever it was, I knew one thing: I couldn't live like this anymore. One day, I decided that I couldn't endure it any longer. I told Sarah that I needed to know the truth. I couldn't just sit and wait for these dreams to destroy me. I had to find answers. She tried to stop me, saying I needed to rest, that everything would be okay. But I couldn't wait any longer. I knew that if I didn't do this now, I might lose my sanity. My first stop was the library. I decided to start looking for information about the accident I had been in. But instead of finding any details, I found only more questions. The newspaper article described the accident, but there was no mention of me or what happened afterward. This only intensified my feeling that something was wrong with me. Then I went to the police to learn more about the accident, but they couldn't provide any information either. Everything was murky, just like my memories. It was as if all of it wasn't real. I started doubting every detail of my life. Was it all real? Was Sarah real? Was the war real? I felt as though I had ended up in a past from which there was no escape. Sarah noticed the change in me. She asked why I was so obsessed with these dreams, but I couldn't explain it to her. I sat in a cold room on the mattress, the last piece of furniture left. It was hard to believe this would be my last night here, in the place I always called my home. On December 13th, I finally left the house. Without permanent housing, a steady income, or support, I found myself on the streets. It was the darkest moment of my life. I had no plan, just a backpack with a few belongings and a few dollars in my pocket. Where to go? How to survive? I didn't even know where to start. For the first few nights, I slept on a park bench. I didn't know how to start looking for temporary housing, and I couldn't bring myself to ask others for help. It was a battle with my own pride. My stubborn inner voice refused to admit that I had fallen so low. But reality was ruthless. The cold December nights in Ohio quickly forced me to adapt to my new reality. I started looking for places to hide from the wind. Abandoned buildings, underground passages, even basements of houses where I could sneak in unnoticed. I had to eat whatever I could find or get from charity kitchens. It was humiliating, but I had no choice. In situations like this, you realize that when you hit rock bottom, there's no room for pride. You become part of a world that once seemed distant and frightening. But now you're here, among other homeless people, trying to survive another day. One evening, I met a man named George. He had been living on the streets for several years and knew where to find food and a warm place to sleep. He showed me a few basements where local homeless people gathered to sleep. It was like a community, with its own rules and structure. People here helped each other survive, but there were always those who took advantage of others' weakness. George warned me to be careful and not to trust everyone. It was a new world, one I wasn't prepared for. I was used to comforts, to a stable life with a plan for tomorrow. Now, it all came down to surviving today. Every new day seemed like an endless challenge. Where to find food, where to stay warm, how to avoid danger, and all this because my own family decided that my place was on the streets. I can't say the anger is completely gone. It still burns inside me. But now it's just part of me, something I've learned to live with. I started to realize that life would never be the same again. I was no longer the person I once was. Comments from Reddit users. Under the bridge guy. Life on the streets is pure hell. I ended up homeless due to betrayal too. I hope you find a way out of this. Betrayed and lost. Reading about your struggle is painful. I can't imagine how hard it is to go through all this after being betrayed by those you loved. Never trust family. Stories like yours show that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes the biggest threat comes from the people closest to you. December 2022. The temperature had consistently dropped below freezing, and every night on the street was a real test. I quickly realized that life without a home wasn't just about physical discomfort, but also constant psychological pressure. Cold, hunger, and fear became my daily companions. But the scariest thing was the feeling of invisibility. People passing by didn't even glance in my direction. You become a ghost in a world that no longer considers you a part of society. I had to adapt quickly. Too many times I went without food or a place to sleep because I didn't know where to seek help. In downtown Cleveland, the city where I ended up after losing my home, there are a lot of homeless people, and they all know their spots. These aren't just places where you can find food or a warm blanket. They're survival zones. The most popular places fill up fast, and newcomers aren't welcome. During my first few weeks, I was at the bottom of this social hierarchy, knowing no one and having no clue how to survive in these conditions. One evening, when I was almost frozen on a park bench, an older man approached me. He introduced himself as Mr. Anderson. He looked about 60, though living on the streets probably added another decade to his appearance. He sat down next to me and offered me a sip from his thermos. It was hot tea, the best thing I'd had all week. "You're new here," he said, studying me with curiosity. I nodded, not sure what to expect. "I've seen you wandering around the city," he continued. "It's tough to survive here when you don't know the rules. I can help you if you want." Mr. Anderson turned out to be someone who knew all the ins and outs of street life. He had been homeless for over 5 years after losing his job and home, due to a series of unfortunate events and poor health. But he had learned to adapt and survive. He showed me places where I could find food, charity kitchens, shelters, even stores that threw out food at the end of the day. He taught me how to protect myself from the cold by gathering old newspapers and clothing left near charity centers. Finding shelter for the night was difficult. Official shelters were always overcrowded, especially in the winter season. People took spots early in the morning, and if you didn't arrive in time, your chances of getting in were slim. Mr. Anderson knew a few abandoned buildings where the homeless gathered to sleep. He warned me that there, you could meet both kind people and those who were willing to do anything to survive. One time, we came across a small group of homeless people in the basement of an old building on Erie Street. These people had their own system. They gathered together for protection and shared food amongst themselves. But the atmosphere was tense. Everyone was wary of newcomers. Mr. Anderson warned me, "No one here owes you any help. If you want something, be ready to give something in return." Flashbacks and the struggle with the past. Living on the streets completely changed my view of the world and myself. Every night, lying on the cold ground, I thought about my past life. Memories flashed before my eyes like a cruel joke. I remembered spending Christmas at home by the tree, surrounded by family. I recalled the laughter, warmth, and peace that filled our home. Now, all of that seemed distant and unattainable. These flashbacks haunted me. I constantly compared my past and present. How did it happen that in just a few months, I went from having a job, a home, and plans for the future, to fighting for survival? The answer was obvious: greed and betrayal. But even understanding this, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of guilt. Could I have done something differently? Was I too naive, trusting my family? These questions tormented me, and there were no answers. There were moments when I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. The snow and frost, hunger, and constant fear completely drained me. But every time I reached the brink, something inside pushed me to keep fighting. Maybe it was a desire for justice, or maybe just survival instinct. I wasn't sure, but something kept me afloat. One dark night, when the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, I met George, a lawyer who had once lost everything due to a failed marriage and debts, but now helped people on the streets fight for their rights. He learned about my story from someone I was staying with in the basement. George offered to help me after I told him my story. He said, "Many give up when they see the system is against them, but I've seen people who still manage to reclaim what was theirs. In your case, the chances are slim, but they exist." January 2023 became a turning point. George began legal proceedings against Sarah and Michael. It was a tough battle, as everything had been done legally on paper. Sarah had prepared well, but George was an experienced lawyer who knew how to find weak spots. We started by reviewing all the documents and looking for evidence that the will might have been altered under pressure or deceit. This process was incredibly exhausting. I traveled to legal consultations daily, without even having money for transportation. I often had to walk several miles in the freezing cold. There were moments when I thought about giving up. Every time Sarah showed up at hearings with a smile on her face, I felt my strength fade. She was confident in her victory, and it drove me to despair. But at the same time, I received support from new friends. Mr. Anderson and George became my pillars in this hell. They wouldn't let me give up. In our small community of the homeless, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: unity and understanding. They had gone through similar hardships and knew what it meant to lose everything. One evening, as we sat around a small fire we had made in an abandoned basement, Mr. Anderson shared his life experience. Many think that life on the street is just about survival, but it's also about preserving yourself as a person. It's easy to break and become a beast here, but those who don't lose hope in humanity have a chance to come back. You're one of those, John. Don't give up. Those words stayed with me. I realized that even in the harsh conditions of street life, it was possible to maintain humanity. And it was this humanity that gave me the strength to keep fighting for justice. February 2023 brought even more challenges. George continued working on the case, but his optimism began to fade. The system was so convoluted and unfair that even he sometimes lost faith in success. Each time we received another rejection or encountered new legal obstacles, I felt like I was falling into the abyss of despair. There were several moments when I considered just disappearing, walking hundreds of miles and getting lost somewhere where no one knew me, starting all over again. But every time I was on the verge of making that decision, the image of Sarah and her cynical smile appeared before me. I couldn't just let her win. Comments from Reddit users: "Street survivor, your story deeply touched me. I've been through something similar, and it's hell." But when you have friends like Mr. Anderson and George, things get a little easier. Fight for justice. Seeing you continue to fight despite all the hardships is inspiring. No one should go through this because of someone else's greed. Cold nights, survivor. I lived on the streets for 2 years, and I know what it's like. The hardest part isn't the cold, but how people start to see you. You're strong for not giving up. The legal process lasted from February to May 2023. Those were probably the hardest months of my life. I had to balance the fight for my rights with daily survival on the streets. Every day felt like a new challenge, where there was no stability or certainty about tomorrow. George and I met almost every day. He tried to dig up any clue that could prove the will was altered illegally or under pressure. We focused on the date of the amendment. It was September 15th, 2022, 2 weeks before my father's death. This date seemed suspicious to us because at that time my father was already seriously ill and unable to make such decisions on his own. However, finding evidence of this was extremely difficult. The court hearings were held at the Cleveland County Court. The courtroom was small but filled with people. In those moments, I felt like an ant caught in the web of a large system, where everything was against me. Sarah had hired an expensive lawyer who skillfully manipulated the facts, trying to show that I simply couldn't handle my own life and was now looking for someone to blame. His arguments were simple. If John had been more responsible, he wouldn't have ended up on the streets. These are his problems, not ours. Each court hearing drained me both morally and physically. Imagine how hard it is to fight for your rights when you don't even have the basics for living. I came to court exhausted, often hungry, and wearing clothes that had long since lost their decent appearance. Meanwhile, Sarah looked confident, and even slightly dismissive. She resembled a businesswoman solving yet another business issue rather than a sister who should have supported me in this situation. There were moments when I no longer believed in victory. One day, after another hearing in mid-March, I left the courtroom completely worn out. The temperature outside was around -2 degrees Celsius, but I didn't even feel the cold, only an overwhelming sense of despair. I sat on a bench near the courthouse, staring into the distance. I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I really am a failure who couldn't handle life. Why continue this fight when everything seems so hopeless? At that moment, Mr. Anderson found me. He had probably been looking for me, knowing I'd be at the courthouse. Approaching me, he said, "John, you can't give up. I've seen many people go through hell and win their lives back. You're one of those who can do it. Remember, you're not just fighting for yourself now. This is a fight for all of us." Those words were a glimmer of light for me. I realized that losing hope didn't just mean losing the court case. It meant losing in life. I couldn't afford that. The case gradually moved forward. George found a witness, my parents' neighbor, who confirmed that during the signing of the new will, my father was so weak that he could barely sign the documents. This became the first serious piece of evidence in our favor. Additionally, we discovered that the lawyer who worked with Sarah during the will amendment had already been involved in similar scandals. He was known for his gray schemes and manipulations, but had never been officially caught. These facts added weight to our case, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The court hearings continued. Each one was like a new blow to my nerves. I often slept in basements or abandoned buildings after a hard day full of interrogations and hearings. But I had people by my side who helped me stay strong. Mr. Anderson, George, and even some homeless people I had met earlier supported me. They became my family at a time when my real family had betrayed me. April 2023 brought the first major breakthrough in our case. We had gathered enough evidence for the court to order an additional investigation into the circumstances of the will amendment. This process turned out to be complex and required the involvement of experts, but we were on the right path. During this time, Sarah tried to influence me through messages. She wrote that I was just wasting time and that, even if I won something, it wouldn't bring back a normal life. She was right in saying that after everything I had been through, returning to my old life was impossible. But I wasn't fighting just for the money or the house anymore. For me, it had become a matter of justice. In early May, during one of the final hearings, the court announced its decision. The will was declared invalid due to manipulation and legal violations. I was awarded a share of the inheritance, which amounted to about 60% of the total estate value, including the house. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to start a new life. When I received the money, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. The victory was bittersweet. Yes, I managed to reclaim part of what was rightfully mine, but the cost was too high. Lost trust, ruined relationships, and the pain I had endured had changed me forever. I realized that now I needed to use these resources for something bigger. Together with Mr. Anderson and George, we decided to create a small fund to help the homeless in Cleveland. We started by organizing weekly distributions of hot meals and warm clothes. I also used part of the money to rent a space where the homeless could get legal advice and help finding jobs. I knew how important it was to have a place where you could get help when the world seemed against you. By the end of 2023, our initiative had grown into a small but sustainable organization that truly helped people. I was no longer the person who considered material wealth my top priority. My main priority became humanity and the desire to help those who had found themselves in similar circumstances. Looking back, I realized that this trial changed my life forever. Yes, I lost a lot, but I gained something more important, a new purpose in life. I no longer hold any ill will towards Sarah or Michael. They made their choices, and now they will have to live with the consequences. But I'm convinced that every blow from fate is an opportunity for growth and change. And although life on the streets taught me harsh lessons, it also gave me the strength to keep fighting. Now, I try to help those who have hit rock bottom. Life on the streets isn't a sentence. Every person has a chance to return if they are given a little support and faith in themselves. Comments from Reddit users. Rise from the ashes. Your actions after everything you've been through are a true example of resilience. You didn't just reclaim your life, but you're using your experience to help others. That's inspiring. Lost but found. This shows that even in the worst situations, you can find meaning and turn pain into something positive. I'm glad you didn't give up. Justice prevails. I've also experienced betrayal from family, and it's really tough. It's amazing to see how you not only won, but also found a new purpose in life.